Thanks. Hello.
So thanks to Tamsin and the gallery for organizing this, and thanks so much for asking me to do this, and congratulations. I'm
Thanks.
very proud of you. I mean, from the last time I saw your work to at the ICA to this time, I'm not really surprised, but I kind of am. It's really quite an achievement. This is a really amazing, beautiful, also laborious show. It's like an amazing amount of work.
Thanks.
So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions that are kind of like off the top of my head, but and so if any of them seem like, oh, that's boring, just tell me to go on to the next one.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
This is one that you've probably been asked many times. Do you make a distinction between art and craft inside your paintings? I don't mean like...
Yeah.
So like there's that...
Yeah, I understand like the difference between the quilt versus maybe the sculpture within the painting. You know, yes and no, maybe. It's interesting because I feel like I haven't really been asked that question.
It seems
which
like the
seems
first
like
question
a really
that everyone would ask.
Yeah, a really obvious question. You know, I think that it's sort of I do and I don't. With each of the objects that I'm always picking, I'm sort of thinking like, what's my sentimental relationship to that? And sentimental is a word that I use fondly. I like that, my emotional relationship to an object, and that doesn't really change whether it's like an art or craft object. But then the second thing I think of is like, what is the meaning of, what inherent meaning does that object have without my sort of projections onto it? Whether it's a book, you know, what's the content of that book? What does that book mean within the context of our society? And that doesn't really have to do with my feelings about it. And in that way, I definitely distinguish. You know, I think, well, I understand the context of like a craft versus an art object. And that figures into, you know, the decisions that I make in terms of like, I'm always thinking about—
In that particular case, you would privilege the art object?
No, I don't think that I ever privilege either. I think it's like, what does this painting need in this space, in this moment? And I think that some paintings need the art objects and some paintings need the craft object, and it also sort of depends. Like the primary thing I usually come to is the first meaning, which is like, why do I care about this object? And that usually doesn't have that much to do with whether it's an art object or a craft object.
So the really interesting thing about what you just said to me is, what does this painting need? Which implies it's not all figured out in advance.
No.
So for example, in that painting in which there maybe aren't as many things as some of the other paintings, can you tell us a few things about that are different from how it started?
Yeah, absolutely.
And is that the case in every single work, even the small ones?
The small ones are a little bit different. The small ones sort of come after the big ones are done, and then I sort of think like, oh, what's an interesting thing to pull out that will be an interesting painting on its own and that can also relate to the larger paintings. They're sort of interesting. I used to talk about them as object portraits. They're very different. But with the big paintings, I'll sort of usually get an idea or a notion about a painting. Like like with that painting, just because we're talking about it, I had this memory about my parents, the friends who introduced my parents to each other, and they lived on the Upper East Side, and they had these 2 apartments that they rented, and without telling their landlord or anything, just busted through the walls. And one side, they just broke through to make, this was like in the 70s and early 80s and on the Upper East Side, and so it was this apartment where one side was sort of all red and one side was sort of all blue. And I hadn't remembered it for years, and I woke up one night and I was like, oh my gosh, the red and blue apartment. I was like, I need to make a painting about the red and blue apartment. So that was like, that idea for that was sort of, I need a red apartment and a blue apartment painting. So that sort of struck me, and so at first it was this idea of this place that I remembered, but I didn't have too many specific memories of it. It was something from a really long time ago, and then I started trying to research it and like asking, do we have any photos of this? And this is an example of one where there was just nothing. And I was like, all right, I guess I'm gonna invent it, but it's really important for me to make that painting of a red apartment and make the painting of the blue apartment.
Both those paintings came completely constructed.
They were completely constructed. So that painting, I sort of started thinking about, I had been thinking a little bit more about deliberate architectural elements, because in the previous work it had been sort of what did my grandparents' house look like, and it had a lot to do with being tethered to an actual place that existed, whereas these sort of tethered to a place that existed, but one that I really
largely
didn't remember
imaginary.
much. Yeah, and I thought, you know, the archway seemed like a really interesting thing to me. I had just finished that painting, and I was like, I'm not done with the archway. The archway is a really nice visual element, and I had sort of done a couple sketches, and I at first it started out that painting was going to be like a little sunken-in nook that there could have been a bed sort of set in, and then I drew through that, and I was like, that doesn't work. So, and then I eventually settled on the archway. So. But to sort of go back to your question,
it started with an archway?
It started thinking about the nook, trying to have a nook, and then...
Yeah, but when you say it started thinking about the nook, do you mean that you painted or drew a nook in a drawing or on that canvas?
I drew a nook in a drawing.
In a drawing.
And then I was
and
like...
that didn't work.
That's not going to work. But I liked the idea of having some sort of an architectural form. And so I was like, well, what if instead of having it sunken into a nook, I sort of bring a form out in front of it in a way that was a little similar to what I did there.
So it's basically the difference between a nook, which could be an arched nook,
yeah,
or a difference between a nook and a room with an archway in front of it.
Yeah, but, and working through those, like once I got to the point where I was making the drawing, I wasn't thinking so specifically. I mean, I was, but I wasn't thinking about, like, you know, I knew it was going to be the blue apartment. I knew it was going to be mostly blues, and I knew that some of the objects were going to be the objects that those two individuals had given my parents. They had introduced them to each other, and I knew that that Bastard bronze and that sculpture of Rama and the rug underneath the bed, I knew that those were going to be in there. So. But I didn't know that everything was going to be in there. So those were a couple of sort of sentimental, meaningful objects that I knew were going to be in the painting. And then I was sort of working out how do I make the painting, like how do I make a composition that's interesting and that I can fit those things into.
And so you haven't asked my painter's question at all, because you just implied that all that is getting worked out in your head and on drawings.
Yeah.
So what I was asking was, you start this painting, okay, so finally you worked out that it's an arch with a room behind it, and it has all these elements.
Yeah.
You might not have figured out every single element.
Yeah.
But so you have some, because of this drawing, you have some notion of what the composition of that painting is.
Yep.
So then you put that, like as a cartoon, down. I'm just I've really
yeah.
ever watched you paint,
yeah,
so I'm just imagining all this. It's oil paint. What's the ground?
I start with like a clear gesso, and then I do a gel meeting and a molding paste, and
So
I knife
it's
it all
acrylic.
on, and then acrylic ground, acrylic gesso.
And lots of layers.
And not totally insane, but a couple, like the gel medium fills in.
How could it not be lots of layers if you're getting this very even sheen?
But with the gel medium, I knife on one layer. It's a gel medium molding paste mix, and I knife on like 2 layers, and it fills in the weave. So then after that, I'll put on just like a layer or 2 of gesso, depending on what it needs.
We have to talk about this later, so I can take
talk
some notes.
So the drawing will end up being the sort of map for me that I start from, and it helps to get the structure in, so that I know that the dimension of the painting will work. I think it comes out of years of making really small paintings, and at first being like, whoa, I have to. When we were in Skowhegan, I had all those full-scale drawings.
Yeah.
That was sort of from the same fear of like, I spent so many years making small paintings that I have to figure out that it's changing a little bit now because I've had so many years of making larger work, but I don't quite trust myself, especially because the paintings are sort of in one shot, to get the composition right.
So you still haven't even started to answer my question. This is going to be really easy because the whole hour is just going to be one question. So now you've put a composition on there from the drawing. And I didn't just throw you off, did I?
No.
Oh, I was just joking.
No, I'm good.
Okay. And so what I was really asking, so here's the real question.
Okay.
Once you've put a bunch of things there in paint, Did anything move around? That was simply my question.
Oh, okay, sorry. I will do sort of maquettes, so I'll do a drawing of the item, or I'll do a sort of drawing on tracing paper so you can see through it, and I'll tape it. I'll move it around, so I'll put it somewhere and I'll be like, oh, that object's not quite right, and I'll take it down and I won't use it. So I'll sort of build in the structure, and then I'll make a paper drawing of like the quilt or the books or the clock, and I'll put it around and I'll be like, oh, I think that's gonna work, and sometimes it works, and then I'll lay it in, and then I'll sort of stop and think, okay, what's the next thing? Or I will, move it around and it won't work, and I'll take it out and I'll think, that's not gonna work, and then I'll go back to the drawing board, which for me is like looking through piles of photographs and like flipping through World of Interiors.
To find other things.
To find other things, and sometimes I know, I think that quilt on the wall, sometimes it'll be in between where I kind of always knew that was gonna go on the wall, but I was like, really? Am I really gonna put that quilt on the wall?
Why? Why really?
Because it was a quilt that hung on the wall above my parents' bed, and I sort of thought like, it seemed like such an impulse to do it, and I thought, okay, hold on a minute, let's just make sure there's not a better solution, because I know that one seems like it's the right solution, but maybe there's something else. And so I think I was like, I don't want this to turn into a painting of my parents' bedroom. I want it to be something else.
But so wasn't it your parents' bedroom that you were trying to?
No, it was the couple that introduced them to each other
on
the Upper East Side. So I was sort of like, I can sort of conflate them and mix them together, but I'm going to hold off for a second and make sure that that's that's going to work the best. And it ended up being that it definitely did. But whereas other things like the elephant, I really loved the elephant. I really knew that I was going to have that sort of shelf along the back that could be sort of like a little stage for it to, like, you could imagine it walking along, or I could. And I knew that was going to be in there. So there will be sort of a range of things. But the elephant I drew out on tracing paper, and I sort of moved it around to try to figure out where along that surface I was going to put it. Same thing with a lot of them. And then other things, I don't do that, and I just know where they're going to go. The books, sometimes I'll just like paint them in. I don't even draw them up, and I know they're going to go there. So.
And is that sometimes partly because it's not quite as important?
Maybe, yeah.
And sometimes because it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So you referred to, at some point just now, you referred to them as items. What counts as an item? Is every last thing an item?
Yeah.
Like I noticed that I'm really fascinated by the wood grain, because the wood grain to me also functions as a brush stroke.
Absolutely.
Like in a David Reed painting or a Lichtenstein or a Johns or something. So is that true?
That everything functions as an item, or are the wood grain
Both.
brush strokes both? Every single thing I think of as sort of, maybe not the architecture as much, so not like where I place the archway.
And so you don't think of the floor as an item, but the type of floor is sort of an item.
Yeah. What I don't think, because once the floor is in and when the structure is in, then I'm like, there's the structure and then the items, I think. And I think you're right, the floor is a little bit of both, because there's the patterning on it, but this sort of composite, where the negative space is, where the floor is going to go, that feels more like the structure.
Well, especially that floor, because that floor is kind of wonky.
Yeah, that's a really wonky one.
Like you wouldn't really want to walk on that.
No.
Or you might not want to walk on that floor because
there's a modulation in the
it's
the
not
back, right?
but it's
a little,
just not
skewed.
drawn.
It's a little fucked up. Yeah.
Yeah. And that leads to another big question I had, which was, well, they're two kind of related, but I'll just ask it in this order. This is a question that, if that other question wasn't an obvious one that everyone asked, this one has to be one. So perspective in your paintings, that's one that people have asked you about, right?
All the time, yeah.
It's not consistent. And so how do you think about it? Like, sort of like, what's your philosophy of perspective? Because it's not, like, if you were to instruct someone to make your paintings, you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Even just on that basis.
Yeah. I don't know, that's a good question. I mean, it's not consistent, but there are elements of it that, like, the floors tend to make you feel like you can either fall down them or you could almost like fold them up in half, you know? The floors tend to have a perspective where they're spread out a bit. They're not squished, you know? I mean, I think all of them, they occupy a lot more space and they kind of feel like if you tried to step in, you would slide down.
Yeah.
So there are consistencies in some ways. And then the other ones, you know, it's sort of a mixture between me thinking about the specific composition of the specific painting and what makes sense to me as I'm doing it, and paying, you know, as much attention to the composition of the painting where the line goes as to like how you're oriented within the space. And sometimes it's a matter of finding a space where those things both work for me. So sometimes with the angles of things, I'll have an angle that's like way steep and I'll be like, I like the way that it feels, but it's not quite right in terms of the way that you enter it. So I'll sort of split the difference, you know, I'll move it back and I'll be like, that seems to work in both ways. So it's not consistent, but the process for me feels like it's a combination of paying attention to the perspective, but also paying attention to like the composition, regardless of the perspective.
This question is just occurring to me, and maybe it's way too hard I can't even imagine answering it. But so it's sort of like the perspective is your notion of the perspective in each painting sounds like it's shifting as you're making the painting, and so is that relation to perspective, what relation does that have to how we perceive the world?
I mean, sort of the underpinning of a lot of these from, you know, years ago when I sort of started to hone in on what I'm doing now had to do with the distortions of, you know, of just memory in a really basic way. You know, you remember something, you distort it, and then you sort of set it back into your mind, and then it replaces the original memory. The distorted one is the only one that you have. You can't recall an original one. So that has always been really fundamental to the way that I think about the work, is sort of legitimizing thinking about those distortions, not so much as distortions, but like a reveal of the fact that something has been processed more than once, you know, in my mind. It sort of changes, and then that gets legitimized, and then I might recall that memory again and clean it up, and it's distorted again, and then that sort of gets recatalogued. And
so you just made an analogy between memory and painting.
Absolutely. Huh. Yeah. And before I started doing work like this, I thought about it a lot in terms of, you know, when I made landscape painting, they were really thick paintings, and I would sort of build them up and scrape them down and build them up and scrape them down, and I used to think about it in the same way. Like every time I sort of built up a surface and it was wrong and I scraped it down and I worked back into it, I thought of that as the document, you know, like that's the legitimate thing, and every messed up layer, you know, comes together in the end. I would talk about it a little bit like flattening a Photoshop document, like when you're working through the layers and then you're like, flatten image, and you're like, oh, they all go together, and like there's your, you know, there's the legitimate, that's the image that is, you know, you're saving that.
Right. This might be slightly related, but let's say in that painting, it occurred to me, and since you just brought up your history of being a landscape painter first, I don't know if you agree with this, but to me, that artwork above the mantle is so much more real than the landscape out the window.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think sometimes that happens. That's funny because you sort of texted me that question, and I thought you were talking, there's in the office painting in the other room, there's a little Earl Cunningham landscape that I put in the painting.
On the shelf?
On the shelf. So I was thinking...
The storm thing?
Yeah. And so I was thinking about that when you mentioned it to me rather than that, because I was thinking like, oh, window to window relationship and like landscape to landscape relationship.
Yeah.
But one of the things about like, it's in the idea of what's, I don't know about the word real, but there's something about, you know.
That's a tricky word. Especially if I had said realism.
Yeah.
So I didn't say that, so.
Well, no, you didn't. No, I understood what you were talking about. It makes a lot of sense. But I think that I think especially I was going to say coming from a tradition of making smaller paintings, but maybe not even because of that. But I've sort of thought a lot about, the painting. When you shift scales, you have smaller work that people have always talked about as windows. You can make a small landscape painting, and it's a window into another world. And I think a lot in these paintings that have windows in them, coming from the tradition of making small paintings. Do I really want to make the window that's depicted in the space be sort of a window to another world in the same way that a small painting can be? And I think that I don't. I think that I want that space to be sort of consistent with the space of the
world
that I'm making. But once I put a frame around something, I get like total freedom.
Really?
And it's so greedy too, because I'll be like, I want to do this. And if I want to do a still life, I want to do, a landscape, I want to do a portrait, I can put a frame around it and do it in a totally different way. And like the frame is the thing that has to be consistent with the space that I built and not the thing inside of the frame.
So if you thought of the window frame as the same as the picture frame? No, but if you did,
yeah.
Would that be a surrealist move for you then?
I think that could be the result. It's interesting because there is a painting in that book from a previous body that has a huge window. And the
Right.
landscape behind it is like real magical and weird. And when I did it, I was sort of thinking about the image behind that window. It was this, maybe you can, is this really annoying that I'm doing this?
No.
You just have it on your lap.
annoying?
It might be at the beginning more. But anyway, it's a really
know
big
it's on
window. It's
2
like a 10-foot
pages.
painting that's almost all this huge window. And it has these sculptures on a windowsill in front of this sort of like weird sort of magical landscape in the back. And when I was doing that, I was thinking, oh, this window is going to it's going to establish the space of the gallery as a sort of it's going to transform it a little bit into being that room that has a window on that wall. So we can all play out in front of it. And then simultaneously, these little objects that get to be on the windowsill get to sort of play out against that backdrop of this sort of wild wilderness. And that was definitely something that pushed a lot more towards the magical. And, that was much older. It was in the beginning of that previous body of work. But sometimes things like that happen, and I think, I don't know.
That's partly because maybe you just said this, but the world, I don't know how to articulate this, but the world within the painting is the same as the world, because there's hardly any distinction
there's no distinction.
between.
Yeah.
So that whole part of the discussion reminds me of the only part of this conversation that is slightly prepared, but only because I remember something that you told me about your paintings quite recently, which is that they have a kind of modularity. It's related to the first question too, which is that, and it sort of astonished me when you said it, because I just don't work this way, because a lot of times my paintings don't have parts.
Yeah.
But that you could just take that piece, either of those two paintings beside two paintings, beside the archway, or that artwork above the mantle, and you could just take all 3 out and then replace them with 3 other things.
Yeah.
That happens? That actually happens?
I mean,
Be honest.
Something happens once I paint the item into the painting. So where I feel like it's become itself. Like I don't think that I rarely paint something out once I put it in, but I do these little drawings of the same thing, and I'll move it around until I sort of find the thing that's right. But that being said, I could have come up with a different painting to put on that wall. I could have come up with a little, paper model, held them both up and been like, either one will work, And once it's in there, it's in there. And I wouldn't paint it out. But I think that when I mentioned that sort of modularity, I was sort of thinking about, like, part of it is also, I like for the viewer to be able to to imagine other objects in the space. And I think that that happens a lot with people. Like, they've recognized something and they say, oh, that reminds me of this thing. You know, like they'll see those like cabbage plates and they'll be like, oh, my grandmother had a different leaf, or like a carrot bowl. And then there's I like to imagine, and I do it when I see something, I'm like, oh, that could be that, or it could also be this other thing that's close. But even if it's not the other thing, you could imagine the other thing living in the space.
That actually happened to me when that phenomenon didn't happen to me personally. It, for some reason, doesn't really happen to me with your paintings. I think it's just because all the places that I grew up in and the place where I live now is so much crappier than the places that you depict. And we don't have lots of...
Yeah. Although your house, like, you have like molding and an archway. Like, you have some of the architectural details that are not that different from that.
That's true. Yeah, maybe that on the top didn't occur to me. But when I was in that room, when I came a few days ago to try to prepare for this, I was standing there looking at that painting of the bathroom, and this couple walks by, and the woman says, "Those are our tiles." And then she goes, "Oh my God, it's also our sink, except the fixtures are on top." So this is pretty much what you were just talking about,
Yeah.
or?
Yeah. Either that, or like, we had that in the Peach, you know? We had that bathroom. Remember the Peach tiles, you know? And then you can really imagine it, you know. I think it helps it expands the space, you know? It can have a lot of variations and makes it personal to other people.
So I'm thinking of a couple of questions. One,
Did
this
we
has
just
gone
talk for a while?
so fast.
Oh, good. That's good, right?
I think so. This is kind of a big one that I meant to ask you right off, but it's a little bit related to your philosophy of perspective. But, you know, the thing and this is related to the modularity, except I totally misunderstood what you had told me before.
Oh, when I texted you that?
Yeah.
That's really funny.
The thing that, the first thing that strikes me that I can't articulate, but that my senses feel when I see your paintings, is the lack of shadows. So I coupled that with the modularity, thinking that just in this way, you know those color forms games? It's almost like those two-dimensional dolls where you change the clothing.
Oh, yeah.
But the color forms things is more, I don't know if that's the name, but there were these sticky plastic things where you could change the, Did you ever have that?
Yeah, that sounds familiar. But paper dolls, I did
But because
too.
those don't have shadows. Well, paper dolls are a little different because they actually do kind of have shadows.
Yeah.
But I was coupling the two issues because it's so convenient not to have shadows when you're going to be moving things around.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm just finding out that you don't move things around once they're in the painting. They move, so you could have shadows.
Yeah.
You just don't like them.
Once in a while, that one that you just showed with the windowsill has a little shadow underneath. Once in a while I do, but
Oh, there are plenty of a certain kind of shadow.
You mean like a distinct source of light? Yeah.
Well, I guess that's another way of putting it, but like, of course, there's a shadow underneath the shelf.
Yeah.
But there's never a shadow. I guess you did just now point out a kind of shadow that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But it's like
No, it's
the
not-
Peter
they're not
Pan shadow,
parallel.
the shadow that's distinct
Yeah.
from the object, which
Yeah.
is what you just said. That's a source of light shadow.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think a lot about, like, I really like these paintings to be, I always think, like, when you look at them, and part of this, this also goes into, like, not ever having people in them, because people always ask me, and I'm like, well, I like the people in the gallery to be the people in those spaces, but also, I really like them to be spaces that can be, like, they're not a photograph, it's not a snapshot, this could be, like, 5 hours, you know? Like, there's a generic enough source of light where it's not, it's not 6 p.m. in winter. It's not Hopper, it's not even Hockney. It's really different in that sense where it feels much less like a moment and more like an empty room, I think. Like, I think that's my hope for them. So, that.
Wow, that was a really weird thing that you just said.
What?
It doesn't seem like a light moment.
Yeah.
But it seems like an empty room. But you're the painter who fills the room up with things.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, empty in terms of no people.
Ah, right. That's
yeah,
another
no people.
question.
That's what I mean. Like an empty house has things in it, but like 2 p.m.
Oh, I completely misunderstood that answer too.
Oh, that's
and
so
it completely it made sense to me.
Huh.
Because an empty room doesn't have any object shadow.
No, you're right.
So it feels like an empty room even though it has objects.
Yeah. No, you're right. I never thought about it that way, but you're totally right.
That's good. That's why we have these conversations.
Yeah.
So I really want to, I have so many questions that we didn't get to, but then I think we should, I just ran across this question that doesn't make any sense to me.
All right.
So should we try it?
Yeah, I'll see if it makes sense to me.
It kind of makes sense. Can you imagine making a painting where you eliminate some of the elements so the object logic starts to fall apart, but the painting logic remains?
So like that's sort of what we were just talking about. I don't know. I'm not sure. It would have to it could maybe teeter right on the edge, because one of the things that I do find that's like really important, I like when people walk in and say, oh, that's my tile, that's my bathroom, or like when little kids run up to it and they're like, that's a kid, kids know what it is, and that's really important to me too. Maybe I would feel like this, maybe I could feel like in a space that sort of had less items in it and started to dissolve, if the elements that were left had enough to them, then maybe that could still, maybe that approach to it, maybe people could still have that response to it, and maybe I could still have that response, but it would be a really it would be a fine line. It would be interesting to see where I could feel comfortable stopping,
You don't want to mess with things too much to make people feel, because that shadowless thing makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, but you don't want to make people feel too uncomfortable. Is that partly it?
And a lot of people are like, I wouldn't want to go into that space. It looks like the wall will fall over on me and that I'll slide right out of it, So there's a lot to enter into with your eye, and you can look at all of the patterns, and there are tiny little things to look at, and you can want to enter it that way, but when you think about physically entering it, I think there's always that element of like, I don't really want to be in there.
Should I keep going, or should we, I mean, there's like 10 minutes left, right? You want to keep going? Okay, I got a couple here. This is a little related to the last one, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to articulate it. You know how one takes an image of an artwork for documentation? Mm-hmm. It's as if each object in these paintings is like, you're treating it like that kind of object. And this is a question that's slightly about attachment too, because it's like, you know how some artists think of their work as their child or something, and we've had this conversation, and I'm not like that at all.
Yeah.
I just once I make it,
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
And furthermore, I don't think I want to say that. I was going to talk about artists and their children. Yeah, since it is maybe I will say that. I have this is at the risk of people feeling really bad about me. But I have this theory that, so we have 3 kids. My wife and I, Lisa Siegel and I, are both artists, and we have 3 kids. And this is not Lisa's theory, it's my own, so she gets no blame. But I have this, so most artists don't have kids, and then lots of artists who, I know I'm going to offend somebody in this room, but I don't know who it is, so maybe it's okay. Lots of artists who have kids only have one kid. Very rarely do artists have two kids, and I hardly know any artists who have 3 or more kids. So there are lots of artists with one kid, they treat them like an artwork. They sometimes give them like weird names.
Yeah.
And so are you treating each of these things? So, but when you document an artwork, it's just, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but when you document an artwork, it's that image is objective. It makes no sense.
No,
Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I feel like I know what you're.
Okay.
I feel like
All right,
kind
answer
of
the
know
question
what you're
then.
saying. How about, well, tell me if I know what you're saying.
Okay.
Like, I think that there is an attempt when I approach each of these objects. I sort of want to find a way where I can sort of capture as much as I can out of the sort of fundamental thing that I think is important about the object in the way that I place it in the space. And by doing that, the act of making it, makes it, especially because a lot of these are items or objects that either were a part, they belong to someone in my family and they don't exist anymore, or I have the object and I'm a little precious about it, or it's something that I really covet in a certain way. And once I make it, I feel like I have some ownership of it, but it helps me to be like,
to let it go.
To let it go. Yeah, and I think that you're right about that sort of, when you said it's like when you document an artwork, there is something sort of, this sounds so weird, there's something sort of comprehensive about the view. If you could pick a view where you'd be like, there you go.
Yeah.
That's
and you
it.
get rid of the shadows too, for the most part, or you have like this one ideal shadow.
Yeah, there's something like kind of neutral about it that does, I mean, when I first started making these, I literally would talk about them as being like, I'm cataloging these objects. I get to catalog them so that I get
that's
to
a good
have
way
them.
of putting it.
Yeah. Oh,
Cataloging.
that's absolutely part of it. And once
Yeah.
I've done it, I feel like even if I never see the painting again, even if I never see the object again and I break it, somehow I'm like, oh, that's good. I had my hand on it, and I know that I can make it, and I made it, and I feel good about parting with it.
Do you feel similarly about the whole painting?
Yeah.
Of the objects?
Yeah, like the painting as a whole?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel the same way, both in that I feel like I have a sense of ownership about it because I made it, which might sound ridiculous because of course I do. I made the painting, but there's something like, there's another level to it where I'm like, oh, I made that painting, and therefore I know that I sort of own it. I know that I can make it again. I know that it's like passed through my hands, and somehow that makes it like, okay, I'm good with that. I mean, the other thing about it is, to me, when it goes out into the world and lives in somebody else's house, I'm like, that is so great. I mean, it makes me really happy to have these spaces living in other spaces. And I wonder if they were paintings that didn't have to do with like an architectural space. I wonder if I would feel so easily about it. Like, to me, the idea of that living in somebody else's living room is like the greatest thing ever.
You love that.
I love it. I love it
much
so
better
much.
than in a gallery.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I like it in a gallery because people get to see it and they get to sort of imagine the space, but it's a whole other thing when I think about it living in somebody's space and being like, it's almost like an extra little room in their house, you know?
So I had this funny thought about that, which is that when a collector, because of this separateness of I guess it's related to the modularity, but I think of it as like a separateness, like, that crazy lamp with the bird of prey in it it's so lovingly painted, and but it's also the whole light shadow thing, it separates itself out. It's integral to the painting, but it's also separate. And so I had this funny thought that when someone collects one of your large paintings, they're collecting all these objects. So you get 10 for one when you buy a Becky Suss painting.
Which is so funny, because when you wrote me that, I thought you were talking about the little paintings, but I thought you were saying.
No,
like,
I was talking about the
that's so
paintings
funny.
within the paintings.
Oh, I think about that all the time. And in our own house, when my husband is like, "Can you please not have like so much crap everywhere?" These paintings are in part a way to resolve that, because I inherited all of this stuff and it's all around. He's like, "Can we just put it in one place?" And these paintings are like the best way to do that. Not only do I put it in one place and I can sort of bring those objects into my studio or just have them sort of tucked away, they get to like, you get to have like 20 for 1 or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Which means I could buy one of these paintings, put it in my house, and then throw away 20 things.
Absolutely. And that's what when I have these fantasies about where they end up living, I'm like, oh my God, what if you put that in a living room and all you'd have to have is like a couch and a overhead lighting. Like all you need is a couch and like a place to put your feet up. You don't need to have anything else.
So back to the little paintings.
Yeah.
There's this really wonderful one on the other side of that wall where Meriwether is.
Yeah, the little
And
open
it's
book.
I almost wish you could go over there, but
Like, where's Chris?
it's a depiction of a coloring book, yeah?
It's
not a
not
coloring
a
book?
coloring book, but it's a children's book.
It's a children's book. Oh, so the coloring in it was.
It's part of the
it's
narrative
part
of the children's story.
And you're just depicting it. You didn't make that up.
No, actually, I mean, I can tell you what the book is.
You want to.
It was a children's book called How the World Got Its Color, and it was written and illustrated by the woman who was of the couple of the red and blue apartment. So he did a lot of visual amazing things, and she was a children's book illustrator. And so that was like, we would get books from her whenever she would finish one. It would be like, to Becky and Ginny, and she would send us a book.
Nice.
And I loved that book, and it was about this little girl and her dad saying like, don't touch my paints, and the world was all black and white, and she disobeyed him and painted the world, and that's how the world got its color.
Is that child you?
I mean, when I made that painting, I was like, oh, that's one of my favorite books. And then afterwards, I was like, oh my God, you're so stupid that was totally, probably so meaningful to me when I was a kid. It was probably both made
sure.
like art making important in the most fundamental way, but also like a little girl doing it was like really important. And it's really funny when I don't think of those things until after I make the painting, which is,
So was that question that I asked you when I sent the questions to you about when did a teacher ever tell you about making? Did you understand what I meant when I said that? So I'll ask the question.
Yeah.
Did a teacher ever tell you that everything needed to be made of the same stuff? Like my beginning drawing teacher told me, the sky had to be made of the same stuff as but you don't do that.
And that's so funny because I think I was told I think I was told almost the opposite.
Oh.
Like paying really close attention to how mark making offers so many different, there are so many different things you can say in the way that you lay down a mark and be really deliberate about it and know that, I feel like it was the opposite. It was sort of attend to the entire piece and make sure you're not just doing the same thing over and over again, which is really interesting. Actually, a couple of those questions that you asked, I was like, it's the opposite of what you said that my experience was.
Right. Interesting. Well, one thing we have in common is that I think that we were both very dutiful students. So a question that occurs to me that's related to the last question is, what is the thing that you learned in school that you disregard the most?
Well, when you wrote that to me, I was thinking there are a lot of things that I do now that I was told not to do.
That's what I'm talking about.
I think it's really, I wouldn't say disregard because it was really important that I spent 10 years not doing it. Like not putting, these are such paint things, not using black. Mm-hmm. Were you told that? I was told that like 50 times, not to use black in a painting.
Yeah, I didn't take that many art classes, so.
Okay. I was told, I didn't take that. I went to liberal arts school too, but that I was told a lot, not to use black and to never outline anything and to never use a pencil on a canvas was like, don't you dare ever do that.
Really?
And don't ever use tracing paper in a painting. The painting that I grew up, that I sort of came up being taught about, and I mean Frank, but was sort of abstract expressionist, like, you know, into maybe Philip Guston, you know, that, well, I mean, he was both, but that sort of painting. And
Expressive.
yeah, expressive painting, and that's the painting that I thought was the right way to paint. And so to come around to making these paintings, like that was really, it was a real challenge for me to be like, you know what? I've always had the instinct to go back to the sort of representational, sort of find, you know, work that looks more like this, but I fought against it for many, many years because I thought like, that's not the right way to paint. Real painting is like oily and layers and painty paint.
It's so amazing, though, when you get to the point where you feel like you're making your work.
Yeah, yeah. And I wonder, because I am such a dutiful student, I wonder if almost what I ended up doing that was sort of my own identity had to be different from the things that I thought were like the most important
It's almost always
thing.
that way.
Yeah. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, well, so much of my, I'm only going to answer this really briefly because it's not about me, but so much of my development has to do with partly that, you know, struggle against my little bit of teaching because I didn't really study art, but also the limitation of my skill. So you notice I don't draw very much. I can't draw. So we can go on and on about that. But
oh, that's really funny. Well, we were talking also like sketchbooks. I can't take I never had a sketchbook. I can't keep a sketchbook. There were so many things, and I was like, but I wouldn't say I disregarded. But it was really, there were things that like maybe I would teach again to, you know, if I was teaching, I might teach the same things that I was taught that I totally don't do now because I think they were really important for me to come back. If I had started using black and pencil and tracing paper and paintings 15 years ago, like these paintings would suck now. They wouldn't be these paintings now, you know? It took a lot to feel like I was skilled enough to be like, that's what I need to do for this. Yeah.
let's take some questions.
Should we hand the microwave? Microwave? Can I just call this a microwave? I was thinking about my opinion.
I enjoyed very much, and I learned very much from your answers. I think you're doing the right thing.
Oh.
However, in some of your works, there is the shape of the hand.
Uh-huh.
Where does it come from?
Just in this painting, right?
In some more.
I don't think it.
Yes.
That rings true. I think there's another
Yeah. At least.
Yeah, but that was
yeah, this
that
one.
wasn't meant to be that, but that was a funny relationship that happened.
And I noticed a few.
I think that is the only deliberate hand of Hamza.
Right.
So this will happen a lot with the paintings where initially I'd drawn out this painting and I was thinking about this being a sort of, you know, a magical space that maybe could feel a little bit more like a child's room, which I don't even know if it does, but in my mind I was thinking, no, so this was one that I had taken the peacock feathers were the reason why I made this painting. The same person who inspired those two paintings, 2 months after I had sort of given up on finding any photos, they both passed away years ago, but his sister emailed me 15 photos of his house in Rajasthan where he ended up living for the last maybe 15 years of his life before he passed away. And after I'd finished those. And so then one of the photos was of a guest room that had 2 4-post beds with peacock feathers on it. And he was an amazing person. He had just one of these places where it was like, there was just amazing things, not just the things were amazing, but he had this way of placing things. One time there was a fire in the New York apartment and his insurance company put him up in a hotel for 3 months and he decorated the entire thing. You know, he couldn't live there for 3 months without having his stuff around him. Anyway, so these photos, I had never been to visit him after he moved permanently, but I was like, those are too amazing, and they just stuck in my head. This was the last painting I made in the show, and I was like, I need to make a painting like that. And I was thinking about the sort of magic and transformational potential of those, and I was thinking about where the wild things are a little bit. So once I sort of set the painting in, and I put the peacock feathers in, I sort of thought I wanted something over the bed. In some of the photos, he had different like evil eyes sort of around his home. And I was thinking about how I love that was one of those things, and the hand especially, like I Jewish, and that was a thing that, like, for your bat mitzvah, you get like a little necklace or whatever. But it was also something that's really common in like Muslim culture. It's something that reaches really wide. And whenever I'm picking like a lot of these objects, I'm thinking I really like things that are accessible to different people, that like are very, I might recognize it, but it also sort of jumps over a divide and is recognizable to like a totally different person from a totally different background. And that seemed to be a really good one. I also just I like the idea of warding off the evil spirits over the bed.
Hi. Sure. It's pretty similar to what you were just saying with this. How much time do you develop to this off-screen narrative of the decision-making of the person who owns this house or who would go into that bed, and like their worldview that's that we can't really get a glimpse of?
Yeah. This was the most recent painting I did, and I think that when I made this, I thought, you know what, going forward, I feel like I'm imagining that person more, and I think it's because I spent the work before this work was pretty autobiographical. It had to do with the home that my grandparents lived in for basically their entire adult life that they built and then was demolished after they died. So it had to do with them. I knew those people. These have started to be invented, and they're a lot about me, and they're also, details pulled from other people in my life. This came from those peacock feathers in Jim's house, but this is not Jim's house. And this was the first one where I'm like, man, there could be some really interesting decisions that I make moving forward in the next body that have to do with imagining that person more, because I really haven't. I mean, I like the idea of a viewer looking and making those sort of guesses, whether it's about my own family or a more invented space, but I haven't really thought about doing that as a sort of deliberate method or aspect to the work. But I think it's sort of exciting. I really like fiction, and I really like short stories, and I feel like imagining those lives could be an interesting way to push the work.
I can tell that every detail is lovingly painted with the sentiments towards whoever you wanted it to be a metaphor for. But since you talked about school and what we are told in school, did you, for example, did the scallops of the curtain and the scallops of the carpet on the same colors, according to what they tell you at school, that you have to repeat these colors all over all the colors in the peacock feathers, and the color of the paper, and the feathers on the, and the feathers on the, and then the Cézanne perspective that you see the bed tilting completely?
I mean, the short, I don't know, kind of is the short answer. Like, no, what you just mentioned, I was like, oh, I didn't deliberately do that for the reasons that you just mentioned, but I am always thinking about like form and complementary colors and all the basics of sort of the basics of like color theory and composition, and I am thinking about those things to some degree, although then there are things like that where I was like, oh, I didn't realize, like, to be honest, I didn't even realize those scallops are like almost the same thing, and I didn't realize that I did that. But the feathers were fairly deliberate, and when I made that decision, I was like, is that too much? And I was like, no, I don't think it is. I think that that's okay. So sometimes I'll like have this instinct to do something, and I'll think, am I overdoing it? Am I just like, oh, that's blue, so now I'm going to use a sort of yellow gold as a complementary color, and I think, am I just like doing this like making this stupid obvious decision? And sometimes I'll be like, okay, I was going to, and now I'm not. And other times I'll think like, no, that's good. So it's a mixture.
Yeah, and the quilt above your parents' bed, and they been introduced by the couple, it's such a metaphor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I enjoy looking at any single element. So I have a visual travel in any single elements of the existing element in your paintings. So when we remove one of the elements, does that change the equilibrium that you feel inside the room?
Does it change did you say equilibrium?
Yeah.
I think it depends on the object. Like, I was saying, maybe I wasn't saying it to you. Maybe I was saying it to Micah. But I was saying there's like a window, you know? And if you move one of the objects outside the window, it's not going to work. But if you shift the ones inside of the, I'm not literally talking about a window. I mean, there's some wiggle room within moving certain objects that still maintains, you know, the equilibrium, to use your word. And then there are other things that, like, I couldn't take out. We sort of had this conversation a little bit the other day about, like, when I was sort of saying, does every painting have to say everything? And it does. When we sort of had that back and forth the other night at dinner, where I was like, I have to make decisions about what I need to put in a painting, or whether or not a painting has to say everything. And I didn't mean what I said, sorry, this is like too much, I shouldn't even get into this, but I think that, like, there are certain things that are interchangeable that will still tell the same story of the painting, just slightly differently, and then there are things that, like, I couldn't take out the feathers, you know? But I think that I could probably shift some of the smaller things. This is a tricky one to talk about because there really aren't that many elements in that one. But if we, like, go to those, like, there are a lot more decisions in that sort of gray space where I could have not included, like, on the bookshelf, and I could have changed it. It could have been there could have been a lot of smaller elements that could have been different, but then certain things, like, had to be there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It is just like I feel when I come to your paintings, I can just look at element, like, as independent things, and I enjoy it. And then I came back and I look something else. So it is like you are in a room with many elements. Each element is like a small painting that you can enjoy, is what I feel in your work.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
And my question, do you think about exhibiting the work in progress, because you are building like a decorative thing? So I'm just curious to see how to have that visual journey to come to this final decoration.
No, but I really like that you were thinking about it. Like, Byron and I talked actually at Skowhegan. Do you remember that conversation when the projection? When you were like, you should project different things, and it was a bad idea, but it was because I had all of these paper cutouts, and I was like moving things, and then I was like, which one's better? And we'd be like, I don't know. And it was like, can we put both in? No, it has to be one or the other, but which one? And we were trying to figure out, like, how can this work? And we had some wacky ideas that wouldn't work, but it's the same thing. Like, you're trying to think, like, you can imagine the space with more than one, and so I think as paintings, like, it's enough to be able to imagine that they're
actually projecting them on the painting.
Yeah, because I just like to feel one, I feel one, and then, see how that progress.
Yeah.
One last question.
Hi, Becky. I really, really love your paintings. I'm a friend of Jenny, and I'm glad I made it here to hear you talk about them. They're beautiful. And I came in a little late, so I apologize if you covered this. But what is your relationship to mark making? What is the effort to hide the mark, to show a mark?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just recently thinking about how much, and maybe, I think some of the mark making in these paintings, like, some of them come from, like, a certain sort of compulsion that I've always had. When I was very little, I would fill up a page doing tiny little details. So that's not a good answer, but that's just a backdrop to that. I also think that sometimes, when I started making big paintings, I made small paintings for years. I didn't make any big painting until 2010 was the first time I made a large painting. And when I say large, like, I never made anything bigger than that. And most of the stuff was really little. And it was sort of daunting. But one of the things that I did when I approached a big painting, I was like, well, I can make a big painting because I can just imagine how many little paintings it takes to make up a big painting. And I know that I can do it. So a lot of these paintings are made, like, with number 1 or number 0, number 2 round brushes, like almost the entire thing, not the blocked in color. And so some of it comes from just years and years of being really deliberate about every square inch because I was making paintings that were only a handful of inches big. And I wonder, the more and more I sort of spend working on the scale, which is most of the time now, I wonder if some of that will change to some degree. And I don't know if that, there's also, we talked a little bit about, like Byron asked a question about oh, you asked about tools, you did. I was going back to that one where you said, did anyone ever tell you that everything in the painting had to be made the same way? And I was saying that I sort of had a different experience where I was sort of told, be really deliberate about like the mark making as it pertains to what I'm either depicting or what, if it's about a gesture, if it's about depiction, but about very specific to the nature of the object that is being depicted. So I think about that a lot with the mark making. Like I'm thinking about what will resonate in terms of the identity of that individual item, which again goes back to the singularity. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that it? I can answer your question later. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.